Hey guys, welcome back to Empire Prints. Today we are making an Arc-170 pilot helmet with the chest box. It's currently printing right now, so you'll see it later in the video. I printed this in PLA on a Bamboo Lab P1S. It just barely didn't fit with my head size, so I had to just chop this dome off with the slicer, so I'll have to Bondo seam that line later on. But firstly, we're going to assemble this helmet and glue it together. Now, when you're welding pieces together with the soldering iron, be very careful about your alignment. You want to make sure you have some tape or some sort of holder to hold your parts in place while you're welding, because if these things come misaligned or undone, you're going to either have a lot of sanding or you're not going to be able to get them separated to fix it. So just be very careful with your alignment. I've messed it up before. It is a pain to sand and you won't get these parts to separate. So just be mindful of that. And also make sure you're wearing proper PPE. Melted PLA is probably the most toxic thing you'll ever smell. You do not want to smell this stuff in. So just make sure you're wearing a proper PPE mask and be mindful of where your hands are. I can't tell you how many times I've burned my hand with this thing. Just be careful of that when you're soldering them together. Now, next thing I was going to do in this process was glue on this front aerator section. But for some reason, I'm not sure why, I couldn't get it to sit flush with these pins. This file is from Galactic Armory. It is a paid file. It's an amazing file, but I think I printed something wrong, or maybe I didn't align the parts properly, but I could not for the life of me get the aerator part to stick flush. So I started with some 220 grit, tried to sand it down. That didn't work. So I just took an X-Acto knife and I cut off the last pin of the 3 pins on either side. And this helped it sit perfectly flush, no issues. I don't know what specifically went wrong in my print, but I just could not get it to sit flush. So you might have to do that with yours if you're making this helmet, but I just cut off the last pin and I had no issue with it sitting perfectly flat. Now, after gluing the front aerator piece on with some Gorilla Glue, I just take my soldering iron once again and go over those seams on the inside of the helmet. This just ensures a nice permanent connection. That way I don't have to worry about this while I'm sanding. Moving on to the sanding process, I'm going to start with the 220 grit pad on a mouse sander. This is great for getting about 90 to 95% of the layer lines out. You're not going to get everything out, especially the rougher spots on the lower part of the print or maybe on the top of your dome, depending on how you orientated it. But this normally, I just like to come in, just destroys the layer lines, normally gets most of them out. And it's great, it's pretty efficient, it's not too long, but I will say if your printer doesn't have the best quality settings or maybe isn't printing as well as you'd hoped, I would go down to 60 to 80 grit if the layer lines are pretty bad. That's what I used to do. I used to have a longer LK5 Pro before my Bamboo. It was great, printed very nicely, but it was a lot slower and the layer lines were pretty bad on it. So I used to use 60 to 80 grit. That's what I would recommend if you have a printer that maybe doesn't print as well. And that's okay. You'll just have to spend a little more time sanding with the 80 grit and then work your way up to 220. But you should be able to get most of the layer lines out just like this. It's just all time. But make sure to take your time with it because you can't avoid sanding, but sanding is also a lot cheaper than buying a ton of filler primer. So I like to take my time on this step. Now, after I sand the whole helmet with a 220 grit pad, I like to go into a Bondo spot putty and acetone mixture. This stuff is just really good at filling in smaller imperfections and kind of getting a good base layer down. I like to do this before filler primer because this stuff dries so quick and I can just immediately sand and get it nice and smooth. So that way I can save some filler primer and save some drying time. I normally do about 1 to 2 coats with this stuff. It depends on the helmet, depends on the print, that maybe I might need more than 1 coat. But for this helmet, I only needed 1 coat of Bondo, and then we're going to sand it with some 400 grit sandpaper, and then it'll be ready for some filler primer. Now, while I'm giving the Bondo a couple minutes to dry, say this in every video, I don't have a resin printer, so I have to hand sand all these little bitty pieces and fill in their imperfections. But instead of using the mouse sander because they're so small, I just have to hand sand it. It's unavoidable when it comes to 3D printing. So just take your time, Really get in there as much as you can, because you don't want to use too much filler primer on these smaller bits, because you can fill in the details unintentionally. So just be aware of that when you're sanding. Before we go into sanding, I have to fill in the seam line with some Bondo spot putty. This stuff is great at filling in the seam line, and it dries in about 30 minutes when you're not using the acetone. So it is a little bit longer, but you need a little bit of a thicker formula to fill in these seam lines. So just take your finger, kind of smooth it out best you can, save yourself some sanding. You can use wood filler and other fillers. I just, at the time, am using Bondo, but this stuff is very toxic, as great as it is. So make sure you're wearing gloves for this. You do not want to handle this stuff without gloves. Once your Bondo layer has completely dried around the seam line and any rougher areas you might have, come in with some 400 grit wet sand, and I just go over the entire helmet. Really pay attention to that seam line, get it down best you can, but be careful when you are sanding. The reason I use 400 grit is this stuff sands very easily. It does not take a lot of effort to get this Bondo layer down, even the normal Bondo without the acetone mixture. So just be very careful. Don't over sand an area, but get it nice and smooth. Once I'm done sanding the Bondo layer, I come in with some Rust-Oleum filler primer, and I pretty much just rinse and repeat now. I sand, wet sand with some 400 grit sandpaper, and then I put on some filler primer. It's a very tedious process, but it's all going to be worth it in the end when you have a very smooth, realistic looking prop. While waiting for the filler primer to dry on the helmet, I started working on the chest box, which just printed in a couple parts. I left these two separate so I can get in between the top of these cylinders and get them nice and smooth. I had some pretty bad layer lines on the main box portion, but nothing some Bondo and some filler won't be able to fill in. So I just come in with some 220 grit sandpaper, because these are a little too small for my mouse sander. I just think it's going to be a lot easier to hand sand. So just sand it with some 220 grit, and then we'll hit it with some Bondo and some acetone, and then we'll move on to filler. Once the helmet had dried, I thought it might be ready for filler primer, but I noticed that seam line was still kind of poking through on the top of the dome. So I just came in with some Bondo, filled it in a little bit more, give it about 30 minutes to dry, and then we come in with some more 400 grit sandpaper. Wet sand this whole thing down, get it nice and smooth, because next up we're going to put on some white paint. Moving on to the paint, I used some Ultra Matte Rust-Oleum White. This stuff is great and it dries really quick. And I thought I was done. I thought I was ready to move forward on the design, but unfortunately the Bondo seam line had actually cracked, and I missed a whole chunk on the back fin where there were still some layer lines that definitely needed more Bondo. I'm still not sure why the Bondo cracked, if I put too much on or I didn't smooth it out properly. So we'll have to go in with some more Bondo, fill in that seam line and that back fin piece, and just take some 400 grit and smooth it back down, and then we'll hit it again with some white paint. If anybody knows in the comments why it cracked, let me know. That'd be great. I'm not too sure why. For the design, I decided to go with Captain Jag. He's only in about 1.5 scenes of Revenge of the Sith, which sucks because it's really hard to find references for Captain Jag. The only ones I had were like on some Black Series customs. There was the Lego minifigure, and then you have the like 1.5 scenes that he's in, and you can't even see his whole helmet. So took some creative liberties, and then luckily someone made a custom Black Series figure, and that helped out. And then also the Lego figure helped me find some design as well. But pretty much just used the references I could, and then I was creative where I needed to be. And then I just used some frog tape. I used the delicate surface one because I think it's just going to be less of a case there where I could rip out white paint and reveal the Bondo or primer layer underneath, because for some reason I'm very prone to that. But just be very careful. I used an X-Acto blade to cut off any edges or any imperfections in the tape where I wanted like a sharper line. Just be very gentle because the X-Acto blade can cut through that white paint really, really fast. So just be aware of that. So because I was unfortunately out of my Vallejo Royal Blue, I only had acrylic at the time, and this was constantly clogging up my airbrush, and acrylic does not like to go through airbrushes. I much preferred the Vallejo Air. So I had to hand paint the details. I did not record that process as it was very tedious, but I ended up using that Folk Art matte cobalt blue. Stuff was great, very close to that Vallejo royal blue, but I did have to hand paint, and when you hand paint, even with really good painter's tape, you tend to get leaks in the paint, which is okay, but it's something you're gonna have to fix. So I come in with my X-Acto blade and I clean up all the edges, get those lines nice and sharp or any leaks that might have come through. And then I go in and make some weathering scratches. I just scratch in random directions, different shapes and sizes. Make sure they're very randomized because you don't want it to look all uniform and neat. It will look less realistic. But I prefer just using an X-Acto blade to weather my paint or maybe some sandpaper. I just think I have a lot of control, and you get some really nice fine details with that. When I finished weathering the blue scratches with the X-Acto blade, the Arc-170 Pilot has quite a bit of black accent details kind of throughout the face. So I just made sure to tape those off and hand paint them. It was really fast and easy to hand paint. I would have taped up more if you don't have a steady hand. I fortunately do, so I was able to do this with very minimal tape. But just make sure to come in with a matte black and be very careful around the edges. If you do end up leaking through or you kind of get a spot you don't want, just go in with your X-Acto blade and scrape it right off, and it will clean up the line nicely. Once I painted all the details, I go in with a weather wash, which is just some cheap acrylic black paint mixed with a little bit of brown. And I kind of just wipe this over the whole helmet, making sure to get it in all the crevices and then dab away all the excess liquid, making sure not to rub the paper towel. You want to dab it. This gives a nice dirty grime layer over the whole helmet and is a good initial step to your weathering. I also mistakenly painted these black aerator pieces white. They are supposed to be black, so I just go in with some matte black acrylic and repaint over them. For the last step of my weathering process, I go in with some pastel chalk and some Mod Podge, which is watered down. This is a good, detailed, textured dirt look that I like to rub in my finger in all the crevices or rub in and make scorch marks. I love pastel chalk. It is my favorite way to weather a helmet, and it brings that really realistic, detailed look to the helmet, brings it to life. I make my helmets pretty dirty. This was a pilot helmet, so I did have to dye back a little bit on the weathering, which I normally don't like to do on clone helmets because these guys fought for 4 years. But Captain Jag, being a pilot, saw a little less action on the ground, so I was a little more contained with my weathering. But he still fought, he still saw action. His helmet is not going to be clean. He's around oils and debris, or if he ever crash landed, there's going to be marks on his helmet, so I like to make it dirty. I like to tell a story with all my helmets. I like to look at it and see that this is someone that's been through war and been through the worst conditions possible. So that's what I like to do with all my helmets. So I really grime them up. Now, because I do not currently have a vacuum former, I wanted to show an affordable way that you can make the clear orange visor that the Arc-170 Pilot has. So I just used some clear sheet plastic. This stuff is flexible, make sure it is flexible. And then I wrapped some orange car window tint over the clear sheet, which does have adhesive. And then I peeled off the protective film layer to put it in the helmet, and this stuff turned out great. For the vent stripes on the Arc-170 Pilot helmet, I just bought some clone vent stripes from Etsy. I can't remember which seller I bought them from, but I got these great stripes, cut them to 5 lines only, which is the perfect number of lines needed on this helmet. And you simply just apply the decal and then peel it right off, and it leaves this great, perfectly vented lines. I was not going to try to hand paint these. They would not have turned out good, and this just gives a more professional look to it. After the helmet had been completed and I finished the sanding on the chest box, I come in with some ultra matte white paint, same as the helmet, and just paint it over the box to prepare it for weathering. For the weathering process, I do the same steps I did with the helmet. I come in with a weather wash and give it that wash, and then just dab some paper towel over. That way all the excess wash gives it that grimy look and leaves it in all the crevices. And then I come in with some pastel chalks and just get it really build up some dirt texture in those crevices, maybe a scorch mark or an oil mark on there. Give it that weathered look, same as the helmet. After painting the chest box, I wanted to add electronic LEDs within the box. I just think it would look really cool on display, and I wanted something to go with the helmet. So I just take some cheap LEDs with the red and black wire, and then a battery box that just uses 2 AA batteries. And what you want to do for this is pretty simple process. You just strip the wire down to expose some of the wire within, and then you tangle them together just by twisting them. You can use electrical tape, you can solder these, but I didn't need a super permanent connection like it would be if it was a cosplay, but this is simply going on display, so I wasn't too concerned about a permanent connection. Unfortunately, after wiring the entire box together, I was not happy with the mess of wires on the back of the box, and I couldn't fit the battery packs in there, and I feel like the LEDs could have been brighter, so I wasn't too happy with it. So I bought some balloon lights. These are like $9 for a 50 pack. They're incredibly bright, and I love them. They're great for cosplay, and they're great for display. They last about a week after you pull the tab on them, but if you want to turn them off, just put the tab back in, and you can make them last longer. But these things are great. I just put a Hobart face shield to back the LEDs to kind of dilute the light a little bit, so it's not like just the light showing through. And this turned out great. It was perfectly dispersed, the light among the openings in the box, and it looked fantastic. I was really happy with how it turned out. If you've made it this far in the video, thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate all the support I've been getting, and if you liked the video, make sure to like and subscribe. I have a big project coming next week, so stay tuned. Thanks again.